So today, let's talk a little bit about plantar fasciitis and what that is. And maybe some of you have actually struggled with that. I have actually over the last little bit. And as a result, I've looked into it kind of heavily. To right out the gate, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a PT, I'm not like a medical professional. If you think you have plantar fasciitis, you should probably see a medical professional, because sometimes it isn't that. So even though it looks like PF, it might actually be a nerve issue or something else might be going on. So before you take a ton of stock in this, then let's make sure you actually have what you think you have. That said, I would try to find a medical professional who runs. For example, Brody Sharp is always willing to do an online consult with you. And if you need more support, then you can work with him. He was on an episode of the podcast in the past, fantastic PT down in Australia, and exclusively works online with runners. So if you are struggling and need help ever, not just with PF, then maybe reach out to him. If you try to talk to someone who doesn't run or isn't an athlete, they might just tell you to stop doing the thing. It's kind of the old joke, like, Doc, my elbow hurts when I do this. Well, then stop doing that. It's not a very helpful answer for something that you really want to have be a long-term part of your life, right? So find someone who gets it. Further, stop can actually be pretty bad advice depending on how bad your plantar fasciitis is. Stopping could actually make the issue worse. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. So let's talk about what plantar fasciitis is. It is, by definition, inflammation to the plantar fascia. I'm going to use my hand as a foot because I really don't want to drag my foot up on top of my desk. So plantar fascia, bottom of your foot, you have connections from like toes back to your heel. And there's this, your fascia is what is connecting those pieces of your foot. It basically functions as a big spring so that your foot can be nice and bouncy and connected and everything can do its job. Without that, yeah, you have muscles in your foot, but we'll get to this more later. This is kind of the whole thing. They're often not that strong, or at least not that strong individually. So without this big connective tissue, the amount of weight that you put through your foot every day, not to mention when you're doing something like trail running, it just wouldn't work. So you need the fascia. And if you put a lot of stress through it, it can start to get inflamed. And that is plantar fasciitis. Your plantar fascia is this fascia, and fasciitis means that it's inflamed. So how do you know you have this? Common symptoms are pain in the bottom of your foot, usually not in the arch. If it's in the arch, that is usually more of a nerve issue or something else. It is usually on the inside, right in front of your heel. So again, if this is my foot, this is the bottom of my foot, this is my heel, this is the inside of my foot, it's going to be here, like right inside, bottom of your heel. It can radiate, it can be in other places, but from what I can tell, well over 90% of cases, the pain is going to be there. And if it is elsewhere, it is almost always going to be there plus elsewhere. It is not just going to be elsewhere. I'm sure there are special cases, but if you're trying to assess this yourself without seeing a doctor, good bet. Next, common symptom is that it's actually often more painful after a prolonged period of rest, and then you go back to moving. So for me, this is a very common story. I'm not special here. So for me, the pain was bad in the morning. And if I ran the day before, especially if it was longer, I'd wake up and my feet were sore when I'd take my first steps out of bed. And it does not, like, for me, it wasn't excruciating. For some people, it can get really bad. It basically feels like you're being stabbed in the bottom of your foot with a knife. For me, it was like a 3 to 4 out of 10, which is why I never became all that concerned. And I'm still kind of managing this right now. I can feel it. But I know like the pain was never all that bad. So I wasn't doing a bunch of damage, and I'm doing the work to make it better in the long term. So Pain after long periods of rest. If you work a very sedentary job, this might also be after you sit at your desk for like your entire morning. Maybe you eat lunch at your desk, then you continue to work, and you almost never get up throughout your day. And then you stand up after 4 to 6 to 8 hours, and you end up, your feet hurt. That is a pretty good sign of plantar fasciitis. And by feet, I actually mean foot, because it is usually on one side, or at least starts on one side. It might end up in both, but it's usually on one side. Another pretty common trait of this issue is it is a like slow period of onset. So you're not necessarily going to wake up overnight and just be in excruciating pain. It is going to be kind of bad, and then it's going to kind of stay there for a little bit, and then after a few weeks it's going to get a little worse, and after a few weeks it's going to get a little worse, and then finally you're like, something's wrong with me. And that's kind of how PF usually sets in, especially if you're increasing your running volume pretty aggressively. You might just think that your feet are sore, and that's what I thought, and kind of how I allowed it to get out of control for me. Again, it wasn't that bad, but it got worse than it needed to. Largely, like, I knew this was a thing. I knew how to fix it. I knew what was going on, but my feet tend to get sore. They always have when I've increased my running volume. So when I increased it this time, I thought it was just that. And then very clearly, like after a few weeks, it wasn't that anymore. But the onset is going to be almost like insidiously slow. So why does plantar fasciitis happen? The short version is your foot is too weak to do the things you're trying to do with it. A few things can cause that. A few things can cause the actual pain or the stress or whatever, but the very short version is your foot is too weak to do the things you're trying to do with it. And this is how, like, we often see this in runners who are quickly scaling their volume. So if you start to just add load and add load and add volume, and your feet have never done this, then you're probably going to end up with some issues. And depending on what the weak part of your chain is, it might be plantar fasciitis. You might end up with a bunch of issues in your plantar fascia. Now, one of the things that goes on there is, depending on your running form, you might end up with other problems, but your entire posterior chain, from your like low back to your glutes to your hamstrings to your calves to your plantar fascia, basically functions like a giant spring as you run and flexes and extends. And this is actually how they've gotten like basic little robots to walk. It doesn't even need to have very much motion. It will just move itself forward due to the spring-like nature of your posterior chain. So if something else on that chain is disproportionately weak, you might end up with problems there. You have a lot of people with posterior hamstring tendinopathy, which we can talk about at another date. I don't know a ton about that yet, but if you have had issues with that and anybody wants that, I'm happy to do the research. But for now, a lot of people, the weak part is your foot, because don't do a lot of calf raises. We don't, like, especially if we went from road to trails, you're like increasing your calf and foot engagement. A lot of us spend most of our lives in shoes, especially tight shoes that don't have our foot do a lot. So as soon as we start running, even if we've never really lifted or done a lot of work, our glutes and our hamstrings are kind of fine and our feet weak. So this is where we find the weak part in that chain and you end up getting injured. So you will often see this when you start to crank volume, when you move to harder surfaces. So if you're running on grass and then you start to run to concrete, then that might be an instance where you might end up with some plantar fasciitis issues. Amusingly enough, a much softer surface, so something like sand, can lead to this, because instead of compression, you're actually just having to use your foot a lot more. Go run on the beach, and especially a soft beach, and you will immediately see why, like, beach volleyball is a slower game, because it is harder to move quickly. We can also look at just more foot work through switching your shoes. If you, and I don't have a shoe preference for people, I think you got to find the one that works for you, but so don't come after me with pitchforks. But if you have a shoe that has a ton of drop in it, then your calf and foot are actually not doing a lot of work because they're always at this obtuse angle. And then if we go immediately to a zero drop shoe, you have a much increased version of getting plantar fasciitis because your foot suddenly has to do its job. So if you spend no time barefoot, if you spend a lot of time in heels, and that includes men with your dress shoes, like my dress shoes have a lift, they're not 5 inches, but it's still a heel, work boots, any of this, and then you go to zero drop, you are likely to end up in pain. So that is the thing. This is why all of the zero drop shoes provide you guidelines for easing into them that nobody follows. And this is why people get hurt. So then another one would be coming back after wearing shoes all the time. So if you, and I got this one from Brody because he actually did a really good breakdown on PF, but that was years ago. So there's been some new things since then. So coming back from wearing shoes all the time, you end up with like say you're going through fall and winter and you're in boots and then you're outside and you're still in shoes. Like I'm barefoot almost all the time from spring through fall. And then in winter, even I wear shoes a good amount of the time because my feet get cold. And if you go from being barefoot a lot of the time to shoes all the time, and then you come back to your Ultras or your Vivo Barefoots or your 5 Fingers or whatever you like to run in, and you end up like stressing your foot. Right? So this could be another thing. So the short version through all the like common thread through all of that is that your foot's too weak. All of that indicates that your foot needs to get stronger to help correct this issue. Now, before we get into how to do that, I will give you the caveat that plantar fasciitis can take a long time to get over. Your fascia is basically a tendon. It has basically no blood flow. So it is really difficult for, even if you do all these things that I'm about to tell you, it is very difficult for it to get better. So it will get there. It's not impossible. You might end up with like little tweaks long term, but for the most part, you can get over this pretty reliably, but it will take a while. I would plan on 6 months, hell, maybe even a year. I've never met anybody for whom it was less than 3 months. And if you think of it as I'm going to take a year to get completely better from this, then that might be an issue. And Karen just said, with my experience, strengthening my feet seems to be the long-term solution to curing my plantar fasciitis. And thank you for that. It's nice to like hear some support. I talked to a couple people who knew I was doing this and they said the exact same thing. And I can put my 2 cents in and say the same thing. It is going to be a foot strengthening issue. So again, it might be like 12 months. And before you have a panic attack, like keep listening. I just want to give you, like realistic expectation for this. Too often, I think coaches online and personalities online, like we set these insane expectations, and then those same people, like myself included, I've been guilty of this, wonder why we have no patience. So I'm trying to be better about that and set better and like more realistic expectations. And that is like one of my things I'm going to do going forward. So you see this a lot in like fat loss and dieting. A lot of coaches are like, lose 20 pounds in a month. And then they wonder why everybody is pissed when they haven't done that. So take the year, commit to it. You don't have to stop running, probably. So let's get to this. Before like keep going, again, you should probably see a professional. It can be a few things. I've had PTs tell me that 95% of the time, if you have these symptoms and this like tracks with where you are, then you probably have plantar fasciitis. You might also have something else though. And that's kind of where we might end up with problems, because if you have plantar fasciitis in addition to a nerve issue, then it's going to be difficult to get better. So the things I'm going to recommend aren't necessarily contraindicated for most of the other stuff that would coincide with plantar fasciitis, but still see a medical professional if you can, because it would help. And ultrasound will basically answer the question immediately if you can afford it. I can't. If you can't, great, I understand. Still probably talk to somebody. Moving on. So your risk factors for plantar fasciitis, again, are going to be increased. And then we also have one that I haven't mentioned, is high BMI. And to be very clear, this is actually not high body fat, it is high body weight. And I usually don't care about weight, but if you have more weight, you're putting more stress through your foot. So we just need to get the foot stronger, and that can solve that. The two of the guys I have in the gym are very lean, but they're like bodybuilder types, and they have struggled with plantar fasciitis because they're massive. So weight can be a bit of an issue in this particular instance. And other things would be changes. So we talked about changes in running, but it could also be like trying to switch to a forefoot strike because you just read their original version of Born to Run. It could be more standing at your job. So if you go from a very sedentary job, I've had foot pain when I used to go from my winter of machine work, sitting in a snowcat or a groomer all night long and for months on end. And then I'd go to spring where I'd work like landscaping or something very active. My feet got very sore for a couple of weeks. And if I were trying to add running on top of that, I'm sure I would have had plantar fasciitis years before I did. So it is not always about your activity stress. It is about all of your stress. So if you're there, could be a thing. Some things that seem to have little to no effect would be like foot shape, and then for the most part, running gait, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Depending on your gait, it could stress it in different ways. So first, treatment. You have to make the pain stop, like at least enough to do the other stuff. If your foot feels like it has a knife in it all day, every day, then you can't do anything else. So we have to make the pain stop. Most of the time, and there are people for whom this is not true, like to the degree that studies like say it's about chance, but most of everyone I've talked to say that stretching helps. And specifically, if we're going to look again at the foot, we want to take the big toe and kind of stretch it back and make sure we're getting a stretch on the entire bottom of that foot. You can do that either by like throwing your body weight into it. You can do it by grabbing your foot with your hands. One of my coworkers at the gym said he managed his by interlacing his hand with his feet and really working into that stretch. But the stretching could be really helpful to reduce the pain a little bit. Another thing, and this is not directly proven, but theory that kind of makes sense, would be as it heals, if we stretch it, it stretches in a slightly longer position. And as a result, you end up it not being as tight. So you don't end up with many problems. Even if that's not true, the concept delivers like a good visual, right? So this could be helpful. So stretching. Another thing that really helped me, even though it was deeply unpleasant, was rolling this thing out with a lacrosse ball. If you have you can use a golf ball, you can use baseball, you can use a lacrosse ball. You probably need something a little sturdier than a tennis ball, unless your pain's really high. If you're struggling very badly with plantar fasciitis, then you might start something softer and then move firmer as it gets better. But rolling it out will work the fascia and will help with some of the recovery. I'll tell you, it's not going to stop the pain in the moment. It'll probably make it worse, but you want to work into that knot. And then once you stop, it should feel better. When to do those two would often be after a long period of being sedentary before you get moving again. So you'll often see recommendations for when you wake up, before you get out of bed, make sure you stretch your foot. Like this is when you would do the interlace your fingers with your toes and open it up or whatever. If you can, I have a standing desk. I'm standing at mine right now. If you can use one at work, then you could have a lacrosse ball at your desk and you could work that out. while you do your job. And then you could take some rest periods and stand back up and, do that. But before you get moving again, you probably want to stretch and roll your feet. This is especially true if you sit or sleep with your feet like pointed. I have notoriously tight calves, so my feet don't tend to rest like this. It's not like my ankle doesn't rest at a 90 degree unless I'm on it. It immediately goes slack. And for most people, that tends to be true. Not everybody. I know some people who sleep and their feet stay pretty 90, but for most people, between the fact that your feet go slack, calves tend to be tight, and you have blankets draped on top of your feet, we end up here. And as a result, you end up in this constantly shortened position while you're sleeping. And this can also be true if you're resting, especially if you sit on a taller chair. So make sure that we're stretching and elongating that fascia and like moving it around before you get going again. Other things that can help would be taping. So I'm not going to do a great job of describing this, especially if you're only listening to this on audio later, but if you're watching this, you might have a good idea. So it's your foot. You can attach a bit of tape, like KT tape, not Scotch tape, athletic tape, to your ball of your foot, pull it to almost 100% stretch, and then tape it up your heel. And then you will put another piece right where your heel meets the arch of your foot, so right where it tends to hurt, and then you're going to strap it this way, sideways, so it runs up the sides of your ankles. And that can be a way to really support your plantar fasciitis, especially if you're kind of in a bind. I did that in that final push to get the volume before my race, because I couldn't really trim it. I needed to get the training in. I was committed to doing this race, even if it was a good or bad idea. And I did that preventatively, though. So I've been working on this issue for about 6 to 8 weeks, and I've been using tape and strengthening and all the things that we're talking about to actually make the plantar fasciitis better, even as I increase my volume. So taping can help here. Another thing that can help is orthotics. I do not find orthotics to be a long-term strategy unless you have something structurally abnormal with your body. So if you have one leg that's actually shorter than the other, then you might want some orthotics. If your foot is misshapen, then you might want some orthotics. But if you are just weak in the feet and you have plantar fasciitis, then we might use orthotics to help you get through the painful parts while you do the strength training. But using that as a long-term strategy isn't actually going to fix your issue, and in fact can make your foot weaker over time because it's never going to get the work. So what we need to do if we're going to do something like orthotics is you would use them to get yourself out of pain while you strengthen your foot. And as your foot gets stronger, you would slowly phase out the orthotics. It's like any brace. If you have a wrist brace for carpal tunnel syndrome, nobody really wants to wear that all the time. Ideally, that shouldn't be the plan. We want to make everything better and fix the issue. If you have a knee brace because your knee's a little tweaky, we ideally want to build up the strength and repair the knee so that you're not constantly having to wear a knee brace. And orthotics are no different. We treat them a lot of the time like, it's just how my foot's made, I have to wear orthotics. And that's not true most of the time. Now, they are also expensive. So a good way to know if this could be helpful to you would just be get some basic gel insoles. When I used to play a lot of ultimate frisbee, I wore cleats, and my favorite cleats had a terrible sole. So I just get some basics Dr. Scholl's, and they were great. So you can spend $20 on insoles that are pretty jelly and like provide you a bunch of padding. And then once you start to get better, you can remove them and replace your original insoles. And this could be a good way to manage the pain while we do the next step, which is strengthening. So you need to strengthen everything down there, your foot, calf, ankle, all this stuff. So for strengthening exercises, I particularly like one called short foot, and it's very weird, and I highly recommend you look it up on YouTube. and I will link it in the show notes when this comes out as a podcast. But basically your foot here, this is your arch, and you try to shorten your arch with the musculature of your foot, rather than, you're not trying to curl it, you're not trying to use your toes, you're trying to make it shorter. It's a strange one, but it does a very good job for strengthening the internal musculature of your feet to make them stronger. I also really like towel pulls, where we'll have it sit down, put a towel in front of you on the ground and tuck it and pull it into a ball under your foot, and then lay it out again and do it again. If it's really easy to just do the empty towel, put some weight on the end of the towel. A soup can tends to go a long way for something like your foot. You probably don't need a 50-pound dumbbell to drag a towel with your foot to help make your foot stronger. So towel pulls can be super helpful. There's also an idea of something called, toe yoga. So if you look up toe yoga, you'll probably get some hits. Some of them might be weird, but basically you're trying to separate the function of your big toe from the rest of your toes. So you'll stand on the ground, try to pick your big toe up, put it back down. Try to pick your 4 other toes up, put it back down. We can just go back and forth here, and this will develop strength in toe articulation that can help make your foot stronger. Another thing that might be going on from a strength perspective would be a lack of calf strength, specifically the soleus, and that is that deeper musculature of your calf. So we probably want to be doing some calf raises, and you probably want to be doing some calf raises in both the straight and bent position. So if your knee is straight, you're mostly going to get your gastroc, those like 2 heads that you can see at the bottom of your calf, or like in the middle of your calf. Your soleus is deeper. You can't see it very well, and it does so much work when you're running and attaches directly to your Achilles. So you need to do some work for this if you're struggling with weakness down there, because it is very likely that your soleus isn't doing as much, or isn't pulling its weight, basically. And it's a big muscle, so it needs to pull its weight. So the way we do that, bend your knees to like 90 degrees and do calf raises. Hold on to something for balance. Try to avoid getting in your quads. I have some instructional videos on this, and if you ever want me to coach you through it, let me know. That will take me 30 seconds. It's not a biggie. And other things we can do are seated calf raises if your gym has a machine for that, or dumbbell seated calf raises. So put a big old dumbbell on your knee, elevate your foot, and put it through this entire range of motion. To be clear, for all of your calf raise work, you have to put it through, you have to put the calf and the foot through the entire range of motion for it to actually strengthen your foot. So if you are stopping at parallel or doing them flat on the ground, like I'd be here, you're going to miss a lot of that strength. We need to put the foot in that stretched position at the bottom and then press all the way to the top in order to really get maximal benefit from all of these things. Other things that could be going on would be ankle strength. So one of the reasons I twisted my ankle was a lack of strength in my posterior tibial tendon and muscle, right? So one thing we can do is do foot inversions. So here, and you're standing on your foot, this is the bottom of your foot, and we're going to invert it like this. So here, invert, kind of rest, like slowly shift to the outside of the foot. If you can't do full body weight, that would make sense. This is a hard thing to do from out the gate, especially if you've never trained it. You should basically feel like you're trying to sprain your ankle, and then don't push it far enough to sprain your ankle. But we want to build some of that posterior tibial strength, because that can help with support. You will often see issues with both plantar fasciitis and ankle sprains in the same people, and it is often due to that lack of stability in the PTT. So those could be some strength movements that would be really helpful to deal with plantar fasciitis. Some other stuff that we could look at once we get your foot stronger and we've stopped the pain, you want to maintain. This is the thing with a lot of a lot of us, the pain goes away and we feel like we're fixed, and you are, but it can come back. So you need to keep strength training. If the thing helped it, you don't need to necessarily do as much as you did during therapy, but you need to keep doing something, or else it's not going to stay better. You're just going to get hurt again. And then other things we could do would be make sure that you're running properly. And this goes back to the gait. So yes, your running form doesn't tend to have a lot of effect to tendon injuries. It doesn't. But if we are running poorly, and by poorly, I mean you are like bounding up and down like a gazelle, should be a little float to your run, but you shouldn't look like a deer. And if we're doing that, you're putting way too much stress through your foot and calf. If you're overstriding, one of the only things that everybody agrees on is not good. If you are overstriding, then you're also going to need to put way too much on your foot and calf, largely because you're probably bounding. And then if you aren't driving back with your glute, then you're probably using your quad a little too much or pulling with your hamstring. And something else is going to have to give, and that could be your foot. It might not. This is where you might end up with high hamstring tendinopathy. But if you're not using your glute's this big, foot's muscles are this big. So we need to make sure that you're actually using the musculature that you're, supposed to be when you're running, because if not, some other weak points might end up rising up. And again, to use myself as an example, I learned to run more in a like bounding sprinty fashion and using a lot of my glute med, and I didn't use my glute max very much. And this was probably a factor in plantar fasciitis. I'm working on that, but this is one of those things where everything is connected. Your foot isn't separate from the rest of your body. If your butt's not doing its job, then your foot's going to have to take more of the work. So it might get hurt. So as a reminder, you can fix the pain while also improving strength. You can use a cushier shoe while also doing strength work. So yeah, it sounds a little contradictory that to get rid of the pain, you might put a bunch of cushion in your shoe, and then I'm telling you, you also need to strengthen your foot. Those things don't need to be the same. They can, but they don't need to be. And honestly, if you're in a bunch of pain, they probably shouldn't be. You should allow yourself to keep running so that you don't lose all your progress, or a bunch of your progress, and strengthen your foot separately. If you're in so much pain you can't run, then take a break. But if not, you might end up actually making your foot weaker by taking a ton of time off. Because if you do a bunch of work, your foot's clearly getting stronger. It's just not getting stronger fast enough to keep up with what you're trying to do to it. So if you stop running altogether and then don't do any strength training or do very minimal strength training, you're actually likely to see a regression in foot strength. So if you can keep running, you want to. You just need to keep it at a level where the pain isn't high. And that would be like a 3 out of 10, maybe a 4. Those were the recommendations Brody Sharp gave when he was on here. Those are recommendations my dad used to give to people as a PT, like 3 to 4 out of 10 at most for what we're looking for. And then the other part is it should be getting better over time. It certainly shouldn't be getting worse. And it really shouldn't be stagnant either. We should see progression of symptoms like week to week. And that doesn't necessarily mean day to day. You might have an off day, but if we're taking a weekly average, this is how you should, like if you're looking at body fat loss, that's how you should do that too. You're likely to have a jump day here and there, but your weekly average of pain week to week is what matters. We need to see a downward trend. So that's how we make sure we're getting better. So in addition to all that stuff, we cannot forget everything else that matters for general recovery. Sleep. I just recorded a long podcast with someone about sleep, and that'll be coming out in the next week or so. So I'm not going to dive into that here, but you need sleep. Without it, you can't recover. Without it, you can't make human growth hormone and testosterone, and your collagen won't repair. And like you will not get better if you don't sleep, period. Next, nutrition. Your fascia is made of like collagenous materials. If you don't eat any collagen, then it doesn't have the base building blocks to get better. Doesn't mean you need to go buy a collagen powder. You can also like eat the gristle on your steak. You can eat the ends of your chicken wings. I don't care, but you need to do something in order to get collagen, because different proteins are different in their like amino acid breakup. And if you have collagen damage, you need to get the amino acid profile that is in collagen to get better. So you need to make sure we're consuming that. And if you are going to do it in supplemental form, these pills that deliver like 5 grams are not going to cut it. We need like 15 to 20 grams in order to give enough loading to actually signal it to repair. And with your collagen, not necessarily at the same time, but you need vitamin C. Vitamin C is required for collagen synthesis. If you don't have both, they don't work. If you don't have any vitamin C in your diet, then that collagen that you're taking is useless. It is just creating expensive poop. And your vitamin C, you're actually probably going to make your skin better. So you might have shiny skin, but your plantar fasciitis is not going to improve at all. Because what we were talking about earlier is plantar fasciitis. Yes, it starts out as inflammation, but it actually ends up as damage. So you have damaged the collagen on the bottom of your feet, so you need to repair it. That's why we're talking about this. So for vitamin C, you need to have it. You can take a pill, you can suck on a lemon, you can eat an orange. It doesn't require that much to both be alive and to synthesize collagen. Basically, if you have enough to prevent scurvy, you are close. You need a little more than that. So take some vitamin C, put a big squeeze of lemon in your water, or take a pill. They're cheaper than dirt. Vitamin D is required for collagen structure. So if you spend a ton of time out in the sun, if it's summer, whatever, then you're probably fine. It really depends on you. Some people just don't synthesize vitamin D from sun very well. I've looked at people's labs where they spend all day out in the sun, mostly shirtless, and their vitamin D levels are still awful. That is probably because they historically came from an area without a ton of it, so their bodies just don't synthesize it very well. So if we look at that, then we need to like figure it out. Supplement with vitamin D. You can absolutely overdo it. So this is not a recommendation for dosage. Just look into it. And by the way, a hydroxy 25 vitamin D test is what you'd get for a blood test. They're like $25, so you can figure it out. And I will tell you, if you're low in the summer, you're low in the winter. That is how sun works. So you need enough vitamin D. You also need enough protein. This is the one instance where collagen powder counts. Typically, collagen does not really count towards your daily protein totals when we're talking about muscle building, because it doesn't have enough of the other amino acids. But it counts here. Specifically, you want some things like lysine and proline and all these. So it is going to be required to get enough total amount of protein for this to do it, for it to be able to build. You also need sufficient calories. If you're in a big caloric deficit, your body's not going to rebuild itself. It just won't. So you need to eat enough total food. And then you need to hydrate. One of the fastest way to make your joints feel better is to hydrate more appropriately. Because if you end up dehydrated, all of like your joints are squishy, watery things. Like your bursa sacs are very fluid. If you don't have enough hydration, your body's going to prioritize your brain and not your knee, ankle, etc. joints. So make sure you're well hydrated to create this repair. So again, nutrition, big things are collagen wherever, but a good dose, vitamin C so that you get enough collagen synthesis, vitamin D to make sure that actually builds into the right structure, and then enough calories and protein and general hydration. The first thing is the only thing that's like generally out of the norm. Everything else we should be caring about anyway, because you need to eat enough food, you need to eat enough protein, and you need to get enough vitamins to not die. So nutrition, the only real addition would be some extra collagen. Then from a training perspective, in addition to the strength work we talked about earlier, would be we could train some stability. So this is where you might play with things like agility ladders or walking in a way that like forces balance. But it doesn't need to be that complicated. We can also do some plyometrics, especially if we're using one-sided. So single leg box jumps. And that doesn't mean you need to like try and single leg box jump yourself up 2 feet in the air. 6 inches, great. Start low, don't fall over, and do some single leg box jumps. They will both create power and stability. Running up hills would also be good. And then if we also do some single side strength training, so I actually do not fully prescribe to the idea that if you are a runner, most of your strength work should be single-sided. You're actually doing a lot of single-side strength work anyway, so sometimes there's a very good appropriate place for things like deadlifts and front squats and back squats and all this stuff. It all serves a good purpose for you in your yearly, multi-yearly training cycle, depending on your goals and background. But here, if we go single-sided, you get also a lot of benefits from the balance perspective. So spend some time doing single leg deadlifts, spend some time doing Bulgarian split squats, spend some time doing single leg squats. And that could be to a box, it could be with like support from a suspension trainer, but anything there is going to be super helpful. And let's see, make sure I'm hitting all my notes. So quick question from Amanda while I run through this is, not sure what was addressed, but what would you recommend if it's plantar fasciitis with possibly a heel spur? So there will be a replay of this so you can catch everything that was addressed. I did not talk about that though, for one very good reason. I'm not a doctor or a PT, and I don't really want to give too much advice on that because it's a medical issue. So if you have a heel spur, you should talk to your doctor. I will say one thing. If you look at the Running Explained episode on plantar fasciitis with Dwayne Scotty, he iterates this better than I could, but this is something I learned years ago, is that when you're injured in your tendons and whatever, like pulling on the bone will itself create a bone spur or an increase. Like if you look at where your bones are built, like your muscle attachments actually create bigger parts on your bone. So if you're getting plantar fasciitis, the plantar fasciitis can also cause a heel spur, and the heel spur can also foster more of the plantar fasciitis. So they can be cyclical. And if you get an X-ray, it can look like you have this big heel spur that causes lots of problems. And it actually probably isn't doing much of anything. It's actually the fact that your foot is weak, pulling that extra tension on the bone that is making the heel spur worse. And if you don't have a doctor that deals with a lot of athletes, then that might not be particularly in his or her wheelhouse. So heel spur, talk to a doctor, talk to a PT, talk to one that knows athletes, always. If you are training for Spartans and ultras and trail things, I don't really care how you feel you rank in ratio to Courtney or Jim or whoever. Running an ultra is a long, intense activity that requires a ton of work, and you should talk to a doctor that respects your athletic background. So that is kind of really all I should probably say on heel spurs. So another thing is, if you look at certain books or certain information here about plantar fasciitis, they can make it seem like the end of the world, even if it's really good information. I thought I had this book next to me, but it's over there. The book Fixing Your Feet is a very good book. If you read the subset in there on plantar fasciitis, it might make you think that you are doomed forever, and that you need to stop running immediately. And I realize that they phrase it the way they do for probably a legality perspective, or to cover all their bases for those who have really bad plantar fasciitis. Because again, if you're in a ton of pain, if you can't get through your day without any pain, then you need you need to take some time off. But most of the time, taking time off is actually going to make it worse. So don't get discouraged. Don't get the doom and gloom. Like, decrease your intensity a little bit. Drop your volume to find a space that you can actually get through in a way that isn't torturous, and then start to double down on the strength work. It's really where we need to be. It'll take a while, again, 6, 12 months, block out a year to expect to like feel little twinges. I'm not saying that you'll be in the current amount of pain you're in for a year, but you should plan for this to take about a year. You're much less likely to end up disappointed, but you're going to make a lot of progress along the way. And where you are now is not going to be the entire year. So I think that is pretty much it. To just kind of run over some basic points. Plantar fasciitis starts out as inflammation of the plantar fascia, the like tendinous structure on the bottom of your foot that creates that kind of springiness to your foot. It often moves, almost always moves from inflammation to actual damage. Most of the time, when we look at people who are currently experiencing problems with PF, there's no inflammation present, there's just damage. So that is kind of why it becomes a long-term issue, because you can't just take the week off and let the inflammation subside. There's actual structural damage to your fascia. So from there, we need to, it happens because you are too weak in your foot to do the things that you're trying to do with it. So in order to fix it, we need to make your foot stronger. You need to make sure the pain subsides, mostly goes away first. And then once we have the pain under control at the very least, then we want to make your foot stronger. And we can do that by strengthening the foot, strengthening the calf, like getting more control over the toes, can strengthen your posterior tibial muscle. We can strengthen your anterior tibial muscle, but we need to strengthen the entire section down there to make sure that you have the requisite strength to do what you're trying to do. And then once you get feeling a lot better and your foot's a lot stronger, don't let off the gas. You need to maintain. You don't need to do as much training to maintain strength as you did to get stronger. So don't give it up completely and you'll be fine. You just need to do it a couple times a week. And you also cannot give up everything that's required for recovery. So sleep, need to sleep. You need to get proper nutrition. We need to make sure that we're training stability and all these things. So let's make sure that we're getting through all of these things in order to help get ourselves better. So that is it on plantar fasciitis. This went way longer than I expected it to be. So thank you for those who have hung out. Before I hang up, I'm going to answer a quick listener question from Fabi that actually was very well timed for this week. If anybody else has any questions, you can pop them in the comments section and I'm happy to answer them before I close this out. So the question from Fabi was basically, how do you return to running after an injury and like having to take a good amount of time off? And there is not an answer that is very specific for everybody, but like this aligns with this very well because slowly is the answer. And you need to find the amount that you can handle now that's not going to cause problems. And that's probably going to be a lot less than you want it to be. Very bluntly, it is going to be a lot less than you want it to be, because especially for most people listening to this, you've run things like 50Ks and 50 milers, you've run marathons, you've run hundreds, and you are used to putting in a ton of miles. And if you get injured and take 3 to 4 months off, and then you try to come back to whatever modicum of your weekly mileage was prior, you're going to get hurt. You need to come back with a run-walk strategy. It can either be timed, it can be kind of heart rate or feeling based, depending on how well you're in touch with your body. We need to come back with a run walk, maybe a mile a day, couple, kind of depending on how you feel. And then slowly increase. And for every increase that goes well, you can increase again. But don't just send it, like ease in. If you take a month to build yourself up to a 5K, but you prevent 2 months of having to be off again because you re-injured yourself, that feels like a very worthwhile trade-off to me. If you try to come back in 2 weeks because you're impatient and justifiably frustrated, then you're probably going to get hurt and you're going to have to take another 2 months off. And especially if you had something like surgery or like a very long PT recovery, you've just undone all of that like work and stress you put yourself through. So slowly is the answer. Basically treat yourself like a new runner again. I would start with like 10 minutes one day. If it goes well, I might try 15 to 20 the next day. And if that goes well, like you can scale quickly. You run enough that if it's feeling good and you don't have any problems, then you can start to scale pretty quickly. But if it hurts, back off again, stay there, repeat that day, take a day, and don't miss your strength training when you're going through this. I often see people so excited to get back to running that they completely forgo all the strength and PT work that helped them so much to get to where they are, which is exactly where we are with the plantar fasciitis stuff. Like people get so excited to be out of pain and able to run again that once they get stronger, they just stop and they don't do any foot strengthening things anymore. And then they wonder why they're like struggling with plantar fasciitis like 1 month and then not 1 month and then 1 month, because you're only doing the work to make it better when you're in pain. So you need to make sure that a lot of these are actually maintenance things. So coming back from injury slowly is the like one word kind of flippant answer. And then if you feel good, we can scale pretty quickly. If you have a big training background, that's okay, but make sure that you're doing it appropriately. Okay, I have no other questions in here. This will be up as a podcast in a couple of days. Thank you to everybody who hung out or even showed up for a little bit. This went longer than even I expected. So thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all being here. Here's to a good year, and be back next week with something else. See ya.